Barents Sea was calm that morning, cold, vast, and indifferent. On the surface, Russian naval ships gathered for one of the largest military exercises since the fall of the Soviet Union. Beneath them, deep under the icy water, moved the pride of the Russian Northern Fleet, the Kursk, a steel giant. Longer than 2 football fields, armed with nuclear-powered engines and missiles capable of leveling entire fleets. To many, she was unsinkable, a floating symbol of a nation's rebirth after years of chaos and decline. It was August 12, 2000. The mission was routine, a training drill to simulate an attack on enemy ships. For the 118 men aboard, it was supposed to be another day at sea. Laughter filled the narrow corridors. Letters were tucked into bunks, waiting to be mailed home. The smell of oil and metal hung in the recycled air, a familiar comfort for submariners used to life below the waves. But at 11:28 a.m., that comfort was shattered. Somewhere in the forward torpedo compartment, a small leak turned into a spark. A moment later, a blast tore through the submarine's hull, and then another, far greater, 2 minutes later. The ocean trembled. Nearby ships felt the shockwave, but no one knew what had just happened. Within minutes, the Kursk, the pride of the Russian Navy, was gone. The men who survived the initial explosions found themselves in darkness, their world reduced to a cold, flooding tomb. Above the surface, confusion reigned. The Russian Navy hesitated, communication faltered, and hours slipped away. Families waited for news that would never come. This is the story of what went wrong, not just the explosions, but everything that followed. A story of pride, secrecy, and human error. A story of 118 men who trusted the sea and were betrayed by it. This is the Kursk disaster. The mission begins. It was August 12, 2000. The Kursk, pride of the Russian Northern Fleet, slid silently through the Barents Sea. A city beneath the waves, 154 meters long. 2 nuclear reactors humming quietly in its belly. It carried 22 supersonic cruise missiles and 118 men. Most of them young, many barely in their 20s. They were out for what should have been a routine naval exercise, a show of strength meant to remind the world that Russia still commanded the Arctic waters. The Cold War had ended, but Moscow still needed symbols of power. And the Kursk was exactly that. The largest attack submarine ever built, designed to survive anything the ocean or the enemy could throw at it. Inside, spirits were high. Crewmen wrote last-minute notes to their families, laughing in the cramped mess hall. Commander Gennady Lyakin, a respected and calm leader, gave his final brief. The Kursk was to launch 2 dummy torpedoes during the exercise, demonstrating the fleet's precision and discipline. Then, at 11:28 a.m., the first torpedo was loaded into Tube 4. The men had no idea that inside it was a deadly secret waiting to ignite. This was the start of the disaster. Silent, unseen, but already in motion. At 11:28 and 26 seconds, a low thud shook the Arctic seabed. It was recorded by Norwegian seismic stations over 100 kilometers away. The first explosion measured 1.5 on the Richter scale, small, but enough to send a tremor through the fleet. On board, the crew in the forward compartment were killed instantly. The fire spread fast, consuming oxygen and releasing toxic gases. 2 minutes and 15 seconds later came the second blast. Massive, equivalent to 2 tons of TNT. It ripped through the front of the submarine, tearing open compartments and sealing the fate of almost everyone inside. The Kursk crashed onto the seabed, 108 meters below, nose first. The back compartment slammed into the mud, leaving the sub tilted downward at a sharp angle. Above the surface, other ships in the exercise heard the explosions. Some thought it was part of the drill. Others didn't understand what they were hearing. Minutes passed, then hours. But no response came from the Kursk. In Moscow, the Navy's top commanders received fragmented reports. Something had gone wrong. Communication was lost, but even then the instinct wasn't to raise alarm. It was to protect the image of the fleet, to wait, to verify. Under the sea, in the dark aft compartments, 23 men were still alive. They gathered in Section 9, sealing the bulkhead doors to keep the rising water out. Among them was Lieutenant Captain Dmitry Kolesnikov, who started writing in a small waterproof notebook. His handwriting was steady, calm, the way sailors are trained to be when the worst happens. He wrote, 13:15. All the crew from Section 6, 7, and 8 have moved to the 9th. There are 23 of us here. None of us can get out. The waiting game. For the next 24 hours, silence ruled the Barents Sea. The Northern Fleet Command still hadn't issued an emergency signal. Submarines, after all, often went dark for security reasons, or so the admirals claimed. But the truth was more political than procedural. Admitting a disaster meant admitting weakness. And in the year 2000, with a new president trying to rebuild a shattered nation, that wasn't an option. By Sunday morning, families began to call the naval base at Vidyayevo, asking about their sons and husbands. The official response was the same. Routine exercise, no cause for concern. Yet deep down, officers already knew something was terribly wrong. They couldn't reach the Kursk, not by sonar, not by signal, not even with coded taps. At noon, the rescue order finally came, but the delay had already cost them precious time. The Russian Navy scrambled its aging rescue submersibles, but most were either out of service or had never operated at such depths. The sea was rough, the visibility almost zero, and the equipment, decades old. When the first rescue attempt began, the crew of the mini-sub AS-34 tried to dock onto the Kursk's escape hatch, but their seal wouldn't hold. The hull was tilted. The latch bent from the explosion. They tried again and again, in freezing water, battling mechanical failures and poor communication. Every time they returned to the surface, hours had passed and hope slipped further away. Inside the Kursk, the men could hear faint metallic clanks. They knew rescue attempts were underway. They also knew it might already be too late. Their oxygen was dropping fast. Carbon dioxide was rising. In complete darkness, with only emergency lights and battery lamps, the survivors took turns near the few working oxygen candles, solid chemical blocks that released breathable air when ignited. But they were unstable, dangerous, and soon, one of them would trigger the final tragedy. Abandoned beneath the sea. While the trapped sailors fought for air, politics took center stage. The Kremlin remained quiet. President Vladimir Putin, barely 4 months into his first term, was vacationing in Sochi. His advisors debated whether to release a statement. Some wanted to call it an accident, others a routine malfunction. No one wanted to say disaster. For nearly 3 days, Russia refused foreign help. Offers poured in, from Britain, Norway, even the United States. But the Navy insisted they had the situation under control. They didn't. Their divers couldn't reach the sub, their equipment couldn't dock, and by the time they realized they needed help, the survivors inside the Kursk were running out of hours. Finally, on August 16th, Norway was allowed to join the mission. Their specialized divers arrived at the site on August 20th, 8 days after the explosions. When they finally opened the hatch, cold black water rushed out. No one was left alive. The official report later revealed what those men endured in their final moments. At some point, one of the oxygen candles had ignited, a flash fire that consumed the last compartment. Many died instantly from burns and toxic fumes. Kolesnikov's last note was time-stamped 15:15, August 12th, just hours after the explosions, meaning by the time Russia even began rescue operations. Everyone inside had already been gone for days. When the news broke, grief turned into outrage. Families accused the government of lying, of waiting too long, of abandoning their sons to protect the Navy's reputation. They were alive, one mother cried on national TV. They could have been saved. That cry, more than the explosion, shattered the illusion of Russian military pride. The lies above the surface. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't come from the Kremlin. It came from the families. Mothers, wives, and children gathered outside the naval base, demanding answers. Many hadn't heard from their loved ones in days, and yet the officials continued to insist that rescue efforts were ongoing. But by then, everyone knew the men inside were gone. The state-run television showed calm press briefings, confident admirals, and rehearsed statements. Behind the cameras, the Navy was struggling to hide the scale of their failure. Russia's most advanced submarine, a nuclear-powered giant that symbolized national strength, had exploded and sunk during a routine exercise. President Vladimir Putin finally appeared in public on 22nd August, 10 days after the disaster. He met with over 350 crew family members and 400-600 residents of the base in a closed meeting at the Officers' Club in Vidyayevo. When one grieving mother stood up and shouted at the officials, calling them liars and demanding, "When will we get them back, dead or alive?" The moment captured everything: the pain, the betrayal, the image that could no longer be contained. Investigators working behind closed doors later revealed the first explosion originated from a faulty practice torpedo, a 6576 kit model fed with high test peroxide, HTP. A weld in its casing failed, HTP leaked, contacted catalyst metals, and detonated. The second explosion, triggered by detonation of between 5 and 7 warheads, was estimated at 2 to 3 tons of TNT equivalent. But what horrified the nation wasn't just the accident, it was the reaction to it. Russia had a window to ask for international help, a chance to save the men in the aft compartments. But pride stood in the way. Pride in politics. The same forces that once built an empire had now doomed 118 men to die in silence beneath the Barents Sea. The truth sinks deeper. When Russian divers finally reached the Kursk, what they found was beyond heartbreaking. Many of the bodies were in the submarine's ninth compartment, the very back of the Vesey, all where evidence showed that at least 23 men had gathered after the explosions. They had survived, at least for a while. In the letter that Lieutenant Captain Dmitry Kolesnikov wrote, a few lines are enough to send chills down anyone who reads. All personnel from Section 6, 7, and 8 have moved to Section 9. We have made this decision because none of us can escape. I am writing blindly. That one line captured everything. The darkness, the fear, the reality that these men were alive long after Moscow had declared them lost. For days, the Russian Navy insisted there were no survivors. Even when Norwegian rescue teams offered help, the Kremlin delayed permission. By the time they reached the wreck, the last pockets of oxygen were gone. Official reports later focused on technical causes, a faulty torpedo, an accidental explosion, a chain reaction. But what haunted everyone wasn't just how the Kursk went down, it was how slowly the truth surfaced. Why had rescue efforts been stalled? Why wasn't foreign aid accepted immediately? When the wreck was finally raised a year later, the bow, the site of the explosion, had been cut off before the rest was brought to shore. Officials said it was too damaged to recover safely. Others quietly believed it was to hide something. Inside the remaining hull, investigators found fragments of daily life, frozen in time. Watches stopped at 11:32, notebooks half filled, and the oxygen candles the crew had tried to ignite. These were men fighting not to live forever, but just a little longer, long enough to be found. For the families, the letter became sacred. It wasn't just proof of survival, it was proof of neglect. Their sons didn't die instantly. They waited, trapped beneath the sea, hoping someone would come, and no one did. When the wreck was lifted from the Barents Sea in 2001, it was a moment heavy with both grief and defiance. The sailors were buried with full military honors. Their coffins, draped in the Russian flag, were carried one by one as the nation watched in silence. But the questions never stopped. Why were the warnings ignored? Why did help arrive too late? Vladimir Putin would later call the Kursk tragedy a great loss for the entire nation. Yet his reaction in those first days, his delay, his detachment, stayed with people. It shaped how many Russians saw their government from then on. Powerful, yes, but distant. Over time, the Kursk faded from headlines. New crises took their place. But for the families, the story never ended. Some still visit the memorials built near the naval base in Vidyayevo. Others keep framed photographs on quiet shelves next to the recovered letters. The last proof of love from a place no human should ever have to die.